o'clock, August 4th, the regular Fargo Planning Commission meeting. There will be no Planning Commission brown bag on Wednesday, August 19th. The Land Development Diagnostic Workshop is scheduled to begin at 3:30 today, if we are done with our public hearings before that. If not, we will take a short break and reconvene at 3:30. All right, I need a motion to approve the order of agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the order of agenda. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. All right, if you've all had a chance to look at the minutes of the meeting of July 7th, I would take a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
You guys gotta be faster. Motion carries. All right, moving on to the public hearing. Item 1A, hearing application on requesting a zone change from agricultural to limited industrial on the Fargo North Industrial Edition. Donald.
Good evening, Commissioners. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Donald Kress of the Department of Planning and Development. Our first item here today, item 1A and 1B, is a plat and zone change for the North Fargo Industrial Edition. Just to locate you all here, this is 40th Avenue North, or Cass County 20 to you old timers there. This is 37th Street North. This property, as you see, is in the extraterritorial jurisdiction. Annexation is part of this project. On item E1 of today's agenda, you will consider that annexation and consistency with the 2007 growth plan, and then the hearing for that will be scheduled at the same time as the plat hearing at the City Commission. So you'll have a chance to look at the annexation too, and that's a separate agenda item. So it's largely just most recently been used for agriculture, a field out there. Here are a couple of pictures taken out there yesterday. Again, our aerial photos are a little bit out of date here. So yes, it's still a field. The zoning is agricultural. As the chairman stated, this is an agricultural zone because it is in the extraterritorial jurisdiction. It would be rezoned to limited industrial. The 2007 growth plan designates this area as industrial, so it could be either LI or GI. It is between limited industrial over here on US 81 and general industrial here along 40th Avenue and 37th. Prior to the meeting this afternoon, you received some updated plats that look like this, just slightly different from the plats in your packet. It's just a little more detailed. The outline and the size, the outline of the plat and the size didn't change. Just added some more detailed lines there at the direction of our surveyor. So there's the plat. It's one big lot here. Here's 37th Street North. 40th Avenue is a little off the map here. 37th Avenue. This plat will dedicate a street that's the full width of the plat, 44th Avenue North. That will tie in with County 81, formerly US 81. And it also leaves room here. It makes a little hula here for future extension of 48th Avenue Northwest, which is not part of this plat, but that accommodates that. So again, the plat, the zone change to limited industrial. There's the signature page of the plat. Staff's recommendation is stated on the screen and stated in your staff report as well. We have the applicant's representatives with us in person here, Mr. Jared Olson from Ryan Companies, and on the virtual we have Dan Mueller from Ryan Companies and Matt Pacina from SRF Consulting. That concludes staff's presentation, Commissioners. Thank you.
Any questions for Donald? Okay, seeing none. Does the applicant wish to speak on this project? Or any questions for the applicant? Anybody have any questions? Seeing none, I'll open up the public hearing. Is there anybody from the public wish to speak for or against this project? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, are you ready to act?
I move to approve with the motion in the staff report.
I have a motion, and do I have a second? I have a motion and a
This
second.
is Melissa.
Come on, Melissa, faster.
I know, I'm sorry.
Pull the string tighter. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Holtz. Aye. Sherling.
Yes.
Morgan.
Aye.
Stoffren.
Aye.
Rosenberg.
Aye.
Schneider.
Aye.
Sobolik.
Aye.
Gunkelman.
Aye, motion carries. Moving on to item, do we have to do 1B separate? or not?
No, though you do those together,
They-
sir.
they were
It's
together.
stated in the motion there.
All right.
The zone change and plat are included in the single motion.
All right, so you're up on item 2, a hearing on an application requesting a plat of 2750 main addition, a minor subdivision.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Commissioners. This is on, as you might guess, 2750 Main Avenue. Here's Main Avenue. Interstate 29 is just off the edge of the photo here. And this is, a commercial and light industrial area here. This is a plat to divide this into 2 lots. That's, here's some views on the ground. You might recognize the Oriental Grocery Store here. This is along Main Avenue, or facing south across Main Avenue here. And then going down 28th Street, that is the street on the west side of this property. Just looking along that street, there are several small industrial businesses. Northwestern Equipment is at the southern end of this property. And then there's some other smaller industrial businesses along the strip here. This entire property is owned by John Lasky and Northwestern Equipment. The zoning here is limited industrial, LI. The zoning is not changing. It is the appropriate zoning for the activities conducted on this property. The plat, as you see, just divides the property into 2 lots. The northerly lot would be the Oriental Grocery Store, and I believe the applicant plans to just transact that with those owners and keep this property down here. It's adjacent to dedicated public streets. The utility connections aren't going to change at all for this. And no further development is proposed at this time. Staff's recommendation is shown on the screen and stated in your staff report. And we have representing the project both the surveyor, Cole Nessett, and the property owner, Mr. John Lasky, with us, who may wish to address the commission. That concludes staff's presentation. Thank you, Commissioners.
Any questions for Donald? Seeing none. Does the applicant wish to speak? No. Okay, any questions for the applicant? Anyone? All right. I'll open the public hearing. Anybody from the public wish to speak for or against this? Seeing none. We'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, are you ready to act? Do I have a motion?
I'll make the motion as outlined in the staff report.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's Melissa, and I'll second.
Okay, we'll give you that one. I saw your lips moving before you.
Light travels faster than sound, Commissioner.
Okay. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Schneider.
Aye.
Sherling.
Yes.
Holtz. Aye. Sobolik.
Aye.
Stoffren.
Aye.
Morgan,
Aye.
Rosenberg,
Aye.
Gunkelman.
Aye, motion carries. All right. Moving into E, annexation of approximately 110 acres on a portion of the east half of section 15. Donald.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Commissioner. This is the annexation that goes with items 1A and 1B. Just a reminder, since we've done a few of these small annexations recently, but just a reminder, this item is not a public hearing. What you're doing is reviewing the proposed annexation to verify that it's consistent with the land use plan. But Commissioner Gunkelman, we do take a roll call vote on this at the end.
Okay.
Thank you. So again, this is the same map from last time. Zoned agricultural here. The entire property, as is shown in the map in your staff report, is designated industrial under the 2007 Tier 1 East Growth Plan, so no growth plan amendment is required. It is adjacent to the existing city limits here. So right, the black line covers up the blue line, but that's touching the existing city limits along 37th Street North, so it's along the existing right-of-way, so utilities can be provided there. There's the same aerial photograph again. Here, this is, of course, I had to get one more picture in here. This is going along 37th Avenue North, and you see where the pavement ends. So that's where the city limit ends. And that is this point on the annexation plat. So that 37th will continue up there. And this does encompass the full area of the plat that you saw. Both the applicant surveyor and our surveyor reviewed it to make sure they match up exactly. So that is just going to annex that area. And again, your commission will review this, and then it will go to a public hearing at the city commission. This is an owner-initiated annexation. There's one property owner or a family property owner that owns the entire property. There are no existing houses or other businesses on this property. Staff's recommendation is stated in your staff report and shown on the screen. And again, the applicant's representatives are here if you have any questions about that. That concludes staff's presentation. Thank you, commissioners.
Any questions for Donald? See no questions. Invite the applicant or don't need to?
If you wish, sir.
Okay. Any questions for the applicant? All right, seeing none, open up for a public
There's no
hearing.
hearing, sir.
Pardon me?
There's no hearing. It's just, there's no hearing. It's a review item.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
All right. All right, we'll have a roll call vote on this then. So there is no,
Oh, you need a motion.
okay, sorry.
I'll move
I need a motion.
staff recommendation.
I have a motion.
I'll second.
And Jennifer, and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, roll call vote then.
Schneider,
Aye.
Sobolik,
Aye.
Stoffren,
Aye.
Rosenberg,
Aye.
Holtz,
Aye.
Sherling,
Yes.
Morgan,
Aye.
Gunkelman.
Aye, motion carries.
Thank you, commissioners.
All right, so are we just gonna take a break until 3:30?
Yes, sir, I believe, Mr. Nelson, do you want to, is that okay? Okay. Thank you, commissioners. We'll do that then.
Okay. We'll reconvene at 3:30 here and the presentation on the LDC. All right.
All right. So good afternoon. So we'll move on then to item E2 on today's agenda. This is the LDC Diagnostic. And really, I'm here just to introduce things, and I'll be handing it off to Lisa Weiss Consulting, who is on the call remotely here today. So just to give you a quick overview here. As you know, last year the city hired Lisa Weiss Consulting to conduct a diagnostic study of the city's development regulations. The main objectives of this study are to identify and to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the current Land Development Code, or LDC, and then to build consensus around a preferred set of action steps towards addressing those identified issues. This process kicked off in the fall of 2019 and was front-loaded with stakeholder input during the listening and learning phase of this project. This included a conversation with the Planning Commission at your November 5th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. And since that time, LWC has, or Lisa Weiss Consulting, has analyzed this input in relation to the Land Development Code and has outlined their findings within the Land Development Code Diagnostic Report, which is included in your meeting packet. The consultant team is in attendance remotely today in order to provide an overview of the Land Development Code Diagnostic Report and their findings, and then to begin discussion on the final phase of this study. And so with that, I can hand it off to Catherine Slama, who is the project manager for Lisa Weiss Consulting. Catherine, are you on the call?
I am, yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, commissioners. We'll go to the next slide, Aaron, and we'll introduce the team here. So as Aaron said, I'm Catherine Slema. I'm the project manager for the LDC Diagnostic project, senior associate at Lisa Weiss Consulting. And with me here today, we have a lot of members of our project team who helped draft the LDC Diagnostic. We have Roger Eastman, Adam Pizarkowicz from Lisa Weiss Consulting, and then we also have Scott Armstead from SRF Consulting on the call here today. So, we're really excited to be here today. It's been several months since our team was last in Fargo, but we've been working in the background, and we're here today to present the findings of the analysis we've been working on over the last several months, as Aaron said. So next slide, please. Sorry, one more slide ahead. And just as a refresher of what we're doing here today, we're going to go just through the background of the project. Next, please. As Aaron said, our team was hired by the City of Fargo to analyze the Land Development Code. But what is the Land Development Code? The LDC contains the development regulations for the City of Fargo. It dictates the rules for subdividing land, for buildings, for what types of uses are allowed and where, as well as the rules for permits and approvals. And then on the next slide, we'll see that one of the catalysts for taking a look at the Land Development Code was the 2012 Comp Plan. Go 2030, which was adopted in 2012, provides a lot of guidance for neighborhood and community development. The LDC is just one of the ways that the city can implement some of these goals related to affordability, housing choice, building design, aesthetics, as well as creating vibrant multiple places throughout Fargo. On the next slide, you'll see that this is a two-part project. So we're in part one right now. The goal here is to diagnose issues with the LDC, both in terms of implementing Go 2030, but also as well as just underlying issues in and of itself. In the next phase, the team will be working with the city and the community to develop alternatives to correcting the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And then the next slide shows where we're at in the process. So a lot of work's been done already, and we're at a major milestone here. And then if you look at the next slide, you can see that there's still a lot of work to be done. And we'll be checking in with the commission a couple more times as we work through alternatives and develop a preferred work plan. And then moving on to the next slide, I'm going to actually transition it over to Adam Pizarkowicz with our office to talk about the diagnostic report in more detail.
Hi, everybody. So we can get started on the next slide. So when looking at the analysis itself, these are the main elements that we focused on throughout. So how does the LDC implement the goals of Go 2030? Does the LDC incorporate modern best practices? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the development process from application to approval? Is the code easy to understand? Can anyone pick it up and understand what they need to do for an approval, or is a lawyer needed to interpret the process? And then we always look at compliance with federal and state laws. And then we also took a look at the economic implications of the LDC in today's market in terms of housing, land costs, and overall commercial activity, and how it aligns with the goals of 2030. Next slide, please. So just taking a quick look at the diagnostic reports table of contents. And what we want to do here is just kind of point out, if you wanted to take a look at the report and just kind of get a general understanding of it, we recommend taking a look at the executive summary and sections 1 and 2, just for a general understanding of our analysis and its findings, and not get too caught up in the minutia of the code itself. But then looking at sections 3, 4, and 5, we detail the specific sections and processes in the LDC that we analyzed, and it's particularly relevant to city officials and staff as well. And then Section 6, like I said before, puts the economics of the LDC into context in today's market. Next slide. So then we jump into key findings here, and next slide, please. So the 4 key findings we're going to focus on throughout the rest of the presentation relate to the inadequate base zoning districts that aren't implementing the goals of GO 2030, the lack of modern best practices, an over-reliance on negotiated planning processes such as PUDs and COs, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the legal considerations, particularly as it relates to the sign code, and then the economic considerations of the LDC in terms of today's market. And I'll hand it off to Scott from SRF to get started on the comp plan review.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so we did look at the existing comprehensive plan, GO 2030, and as Catherine mentioned earlier, there is, we're looking specifically more at the land use policy and how that relates and how that translates down to the land development code. So these are just some examples listed here, and part of that as well are the ideas, or the catalysts that are essentially, and they're mapped out in your comprehensive plan. There's a catalyst map. For example, here's a little screenshot of the Sanford Medical Center area, which is envisioned to be a mixed-use center, for example. But that catalyst map is really the closest thing you have in your comprehensive plan to what many other cities have, is what is a closest thing to a future land use plan or a future land use map. And we also looked at related documents that have a bearing on the land development code, such as the Downtown in Focus plan, which is the more recent one, but also the parking access plan. So some of the plans or studies that MetroCog has been involved with as well. Next slide. Okay, so when looking at how well the zoning districts implement or are consistent with GO 2030, a number of things to talk about here. The conventional districts, or most of the districts in the code, so I'm talking about single family development, multifamily, commercial, industrial, those districts for the most part do not align with the goals that I alluded to earlier in GO 2030. And a lot of that has to do with walkability. For example, there's the photo on the bottom right of a parking lot there. And a lot of the GO 2030 talks about promoting walkability, but at the same time, the districts don't talk about where parking lots, just as an example, where parking lots should be located in reference to the street. So here you have a mixed use development, which is great, but there's a parking lot in between the development and the street, which can discourage walkability. So that's just an example. There are districts, as you're all aware, downtown mixed use, university mixed use, that are mixed use districts that are much more closer to the goals in GO 2030, but there's still areas of refinement that we've found. And then all of this, what the issue with all of this is that the development community, because these districts really don't work to get to what GO 2030 is envisioning, there's a lot of reliance on negotiated zoning. So as Adam mentioned, plan unit development districts, conditional overlays, even CUPs, things like that. And as we heard through the public involvement of this project earlier, for the most part, the neighborhood folks, the development community, they're not very happy with the process that results. It's a protracted process and pretty unpredictable in many cases. So next slide, please. And looking at a big picture in terms of how neighborhoods are laid out and planned, and getting to the subdivision regulations and how those carry out the GO 2030. Really, the biggest issue we found is that the subdivision regulations are incompatible with a lot of the historical development patterns you have in the core of the city. So talking about narrower lots, narrow street widths, alleys, things like that. And that gets at a lack of right-of-way flexibility in some cases, or a lack of ability to, or the placement of utilities is another issue that was discovered through the process so far. And a lot of that, what does that translate to? Well, it translates to heavy reliance on development with private infrastructure. So again, using planned unit developments as an example here with the High Point subdivision to make development fit in the core areas. Next slide. And Go 2030 talks a lot about housing affordability and also promoting more of a mix of housing types, housing choice. And when we talk about a mix of housing choice, we also talk about this relatively newer concept of the missing middle. So what's in between detached single family housing and higher density multifamily? So that missing middle. And we did look at the code to see if it addresses missing the need for and demand for missing middle housing. And so getting back to affordability though, and really the conventional multifamily zoning, a lot of the requirements therein do promote or stress the need for larger lots to make setback requirements and other requirements work, and that drives up housing costs because it increases the need for more land. And then one of the issues, especially in the core, is any alternatives to what is conventional typically requires, again, as has been mentioned a number of times, PUDs and other negotiated zoning tools, which to get those approved requires consistency with Go 2030. Very hard to do when you don't have a future land use map to rely upon. And then the bonus density provision is an issue as well that has a open space requirement that ends up driving up lot sizes and therein increases housing cost. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it off to Adam to talk about best practices.
Thanks, Scott.
So,
yep.
Sorry, go ahead.
Echo here. Okay. So when looking at the best practices, this is one example that we came up with. So we want to start with a distinction between the building form standards in the downtown mixed-use district and the university mixed-use district versus the remaining 18 other base zoning districts. So the lack of building form standards in these remaining 18 base zoning districts creates unpredictable outcomes in terms of how the development will look on the ground. And that also incorporates ad hoc design requirements per project. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. So that creates a certain uncertainty in the development in terms of how the development will look. And then when looking at the DMU and the UMU, that has more existing build form standards that create some predictability, but in incorporating a few modern best practices, it would help solidify even more predictability. So when we looked at the Downtown in Focus plan, we were in agreement with the recommendations set forth there for standards such as a build to zone, which requires the building to be built at the sidewalk property line, and transparency standards to maximize the amount of windows on the first floor facades to ensure that any development in those zones will help create a vibrant pedestrian environment as it's stated in Go 2030. Next slide, please. So it's just another example here. So we found that there's a certain inflexibility and lack of clarity in some of the development standards. And two examples here are the landscaping and parking location. And through our stakeholder interviews, we just found that the issue of landscaping being inflexible tended to hold up development approvals, and we heard this many times. So we have a quick example of how to bring more clarity to that process, along with the parking location, as Scott had mentioned before in that previous example. Giving more clarity to the applicant as to where the parking should be placed, which it then further aligns with your goals of walkability in Go 2030. So the flexibility and clarity would lead towards more the quality development that the city is looking for. And a modern best practice that's widely used is a minor modifications process. So that adds flexibility to the development standards within a certain percentage of changing it, while also achieving the goals and the intent of the LDC and Go 2030. Next slide, please. So then, as Scott had mentioned before, this over-reliance on negotiated processes in the base zoning districts, we saw the use of CUPs and PUDs and COs to achieve some of these development goals in one way or another. So it connects back to the inadequacy. And due to this, the PUD process is utilized as a way of incorporating development elements that are not addressed in the current LDC, either adding or trying to achieve something else. So we see this, as you can see in the screenshot there of the map. There's many of these developments throughout the city, and it kind of creates this irregular and uneven development pattern throughout the city that also incorporates these ad hoc design standards rather than sort of centralizing it. And then connected to that is the residential protection standards. And we found through the stakeholder interviews that these protection standards, they're a good thing to be in the LDC, but they tend to get watered down in the development approval process. And then it creates a gray area in implementing the standards and enforcing them well after the development is completed. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the LDC itself and the processes, some uncodified or negotiated processes, two examples that we found was the site plan review process and the parkland dedication process. So the site plan thresholds in the LDC, while they are stated in the code itself, they seem to be carried out differently in practice. And then similarly with the parkland dedication, the process seems to be a routine element of the subdivision process, but it's not incorporated at all into the LDC. So the uncodified procedures such as these create an unpredictable development review process, and there's a need for a clear threshold in the discretionary approvals in the LDC. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Roger to discuss the legal analysis portion of the analysis.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Roger Eastman, Director with Leasewise Consulting. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Most of the legal work is actually being taken in-house by the City Attorney's Office. We, though, provided a high-level review of the sign code. And what I thought I'd do this afternoon is take a few minutes to talk about this really important U.S. Supreme Court case, Reed v. Town of Gilbert, that came out in June of 2015, that honestly changed the landscape for sign regulation. Now, we're not attorneys, we're planners, but we do understand at least the basics of Reed and the importance of making sure a sign code is content neutral. And in the next few minutes, I want to explain what that means and where there is some work to be done in the Fargo sign code. So let's go back in time just a little bit. Pastor Clyde Reed ran this small church, the Good News Presbyterian Church in the town of Gilbert, southeast of Phoenix in Arizona. And because he was small, he had to move the location of the church from one location to another. And in order to ensure he could attract people to the church, he put signs out like this one you see in this image on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening in preparation for the Sunday morning church service. And this is honestly where he ran into problems with a city code enforcement officer. So if you look on the next slide, this particular sign was called a temporary directional sign relating to a qualifying event. And the rules for that sign type were that it could be placed on private or public land. It needed to be placed 12 hours before the event and removed 1 hour after. And that was naturally a problem then for the pastor because his services were on a Sunday morning. He was putting his signs out on a Saturday evening, which made sense, but he was in violation of the code. Because if you put it up at 9 o'clock in the evening, nobody would actually get to see the signs. So cutting a long story short, the town of Gilbert landed up going through a litany of courts, ultimately to the Ninth Circuit and to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Reed because they determined that the town of Gilbert had a sign code, at least for temporary signs, that was content-based. And you can see that summarized in this graphic. We've talked about the temporary directional sign, but look at the different standards for placement and length of time for a political sign or for an ideological sign. And because the town was regulating their temporary signs based on the message conveyed, ideological, political, real estate, temporary directional sign, or whatever, and you had different standards for those sign types, the court ruled in favor of the town of Gilbert. So if we go to the next slide, the court reinforced previous decisions that said sign regulations need to be content neutral, where they don't regulate the sign based on the message it conveys. So in this case, it would be a freestanding sign or a building-mounted sign, and it's time, place, or manner regulations that describe the sign, rather than what the sign says in terms of its message. So whether you're voting for Waldo or some other sign, that's a content-based regulation. And so this leads to an interesting problem for communities. And as you can see on this next slide, we have a right as Americans to freedom of speech. It truly is an existential right built into the Constitution. And the challenge for any community is balancing the needs for election cycles, for people wanting to put out their ideological message, to promoting their businesses, with the needs of a community to define its special character. And so how do you find this special balance? And honestly, under Reed, it's become even harder. Let's look at the next slide, please. But fortunately, there are solutions. And while it does take planning staff, and I've been a planner in a local government, so I know what it's like, it does take a while to get your head to kind of shift a little bit, to rethink the approach. But you can get rid of contractor signs, real estate signs, grand opening signs, and so on that are temporary sign types now that are content-based, and reframe the conversation as yard signs, banner signs, A-frame signs, and so on. Fortunately, your permanent sign section is mostly content neutral, but some of those sign types now need to be rethought of as freestanding or wall signs. Next slide, please. And I think at this point, we're going to hand off to Dave Bergman.
Hi, thank you. So one of the other issues that we were asked to examine is how the development code may be influencing the ability of Fargo to attract investment and to produce the kinds of spaces that are envisioned in the city's plan. And in general, to step back and to recognize that successful communities, and many communities that you may visit or admire, often use these mixed-use developments to create districts that are attractive, become destinations within the community, and generate rounds of adjacent and sympathetic investment. So the advantages of mixed-use development, it provides multiple revenue streams for a developer, and also from a point of view of fiscal impacts and taxation, and often generates, these projects will often generate premium rents. From a municipal perspective, there can, and also from a developer's perspective, they can be more efficient in terms of use of on-site infrastructure and land consumption. They can, particularly if you pursue vertical mixes as they go above a first and second story of uses, you can use shared parking standards, and this can lower development costs, and it can also lower service costs from a municipality standpoint. These often produce high amenity development that creates value for neighboring and adjacent properties. And two examples that we looked at in the report that may be of familiarity to your residents and to yourself in comparable or competitive communities nearby are Oxarbin Village in Omaha or the Stapleton area of Denver. These are both take place in an infill context where they are replacing a previous use that creates a node of activity or a town center within the broader urban fabric that attracts additional rounds of investment both at the development site and on adjacent properties. Go to the next, please. So we're specifically looking at the local development code. The lack of design standards in the code can inhibit the generation of some of these external benefits to the public realm, to the neighborhood, or impede the creation of a coherent district. As it stands now, mixed-use development is only envisioned within the DMU and UMU zones. And I think this last point is maybe the most important economic point, which is that a dependence on planned unit development and CUPs and related negotiated agreements, while the idea is to produce flexibility, it actually creates a lot of uncertainty in the environment, particularly if an investor or property owner doesn't have certainty as to what the adjacent land use is going to be. It will inhibit them from making a particular investment. So having a mixed-use district perspective that has high-quality development standards can actually serve as an incentive by providing certainty to allow property owners and investors to move forward with creating high-quality products in the city.
All right, thank you, David. So thank you for listening, everybody. Our next steps for this project are to discuss our findings in the diagnostic report with you all this afternoon, and then moving into the fall, we'll be working with the city and the community on alternatives, and then working through a preferred alternative and a work plan to address these issues in the winter. And with that, I will turn it back to Aaron and the chair for discussion.
So Catherine, would you like to kind of lead us off in the discussion?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. So if you want to go to the next slide, we're more than happy to answer any questions that the commission may have regarding our methodology, our findings, or next steps. But we do have some questions that we developed that may help, spur the conversation and also help our team get a sense of, the commission's thinking and moving forward as we start to develop alternatives. So some of the questions that we have for you as a team are, first and foremost, did we get it right? Are the things that were mentioned this afternoon, are these, is this correct? Are these issues that you've heard of, that you've seen within your community? Are there issues that you've been experiencing as a commission with projects that are coming in that you're aware of that we did not discuss this afternoon? Next, what are some of your priority objectives in updating and amending potentially the land development code? As Scott mentioned, there's a lot of information in the comp plan, and there's a lot that can be done, but sometimes it's important to think about priorities, especially with regard to the development regulations. There can be competing thoughts and competing approaches into implementing some of these goals of the comprehensive plan. Also, what's as a commission, what are some of the additional information or guidance that the Land Development Code can provide you all as a review body to ensure that you're given the tools that you are needed to address project applications as they're coming through. So those are some of our questions that we have for you, and we'll let you either respond to those or have your own set of questions.
So I think, Mr. Chairman, I can hand it back to you if you'd like to kind of lead some discussion. I don't think we need to stay in any particular order, and we don't have to stick to these questions either. It's kind of an open floor here.
Okay. I might start it off with a couple questions myself. Without coming out and saying it in the discussion that we've listened to, does this lead to a more of a form-based type of zoning that we've heard about, that we actually, as a commission, probably need to have our own education sessions on that? And then one other question of mine would be, do you ever get too much mixed use? As a lot of us, and this isn't a good timing in our in the system right now with the COVID crisis, but to me, do we get to a point where there's too many, a lot of these mixed use buildings or projects, it's a lot of expensive space, and you tend to see a lot of it even vacant right now. Do you ever get too much of it?
Sure. So I'll tackle the first question, and then maybe the first part of the question on mixed use, and may ask David also to weigh in on that. But first and foremost, in terms of form-based code, not necessarily. I know that form-based regulations was one of the recommendations in the Downtown in Focus plan. So I think that's something that the city has obviously shown interest in. And what the alternatives report may do is, introduce or consider the pros and cons of form-based regulations for the city in a limited or more widespread application. But again, this is just alternatives for the city to consider. And it may, it does not necessarily lead to form-based regulations, but it's likely that because of the benefit of the application of form-based regulations, that we would see some benefit of utilizing that tool to address some of the concerns, particularly with walkability, predictability, high quality design, and some ways to increase housing choice in the downtown particularly. But again, that's an alternative that may be considered, and not necessarily the only path to move forward with. And as part of the alternatives that will develop, there definitely can be an educational component to that, with any sort of tools or regulatory tools that the city decides to utilize as part of this effort. And then regarding mixed use, I would say yes. My gut would say that yes, there is probably a limit to how much a market could support in terms of different types of commercial. But if David, if I could pass that to you.
Yeah, there's no question that you need to calibrate to the market. But also remember, your development plan and your general plan are going to live longer than any development cycle. So you want to be pre-positioned in such a way to produce the kinds of spaces that match the community vision. And keep in mind, sometimes mixed-use projects in big central cities, people tend to think of them as, extremely large scale, maybe department store anchored with, tall towers of condominiums above them. In some cases, it's just really as simple as being able to put a couple thousand square feet of a bakery and a coffee shop on the ground floor of a 3 to 4 story apartment building. and that creates premium rents for the apartments. It's an amenity. It becomes a neighborhood amenity that people can walk to. And it also is opportunities for shared parking infrastructure. So it's a scalable concept, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions? Don?
I have a question. There has been for a long time the recognition of density as being economically more feasible and just a better way to operate. But as we've seen with the pandemic, just the opposite is being recommended, where space is considered a value. So I remember when I was in college, I studied sociology, and they were saying when you come to a certain point of density among people, that they become unhealthier psychologically and physically as well. So the trend, and I don't know whether this is the case or not, but I'd heard that in Minneapolis, for instance, that the size of an apartments had been downscaled to get more people into a building, therefore also making them more profitable for the developers. And I'm just wondering if you've studied at all, this ratio that has to do with health and well-being and density. So another example of that is that when you go into most people's apartments, you'll see a photograph or a painting of a vista. You'll see where you can see off into the distance. So I'm thinking that that's a value for people rather than the idea of just being packed into as tight a quarters as possible. So even within that psychological sense, it seems to me that there has to be some threshold where health and well-being come into play. Is that something you've studied?
So, that's a very interesting comment there. So the direct relationship, if there is one, of density and public health, especially in light of the pandemic, is not something that we have studied. I think that there are a lot of people thinking about these very things over the past few months, given what's been happening around the world and the way that we build and develop our communities. I think we're thinking about the impact of the proximity of people to health, but I think that there's also going to be thought processes related to the quality of the places, not necessarily the size of the apartment or the size of the house, but also access, more access to open spaces, more access to community gathering places, or making those community gathering places larger. Now that we're seeing that when we're in urban settings, that people do want to get out of their house and they do want to be able to go out and recreate and exercise, and those places need to be larger, or that sidewalks need to be wider. That the answer isn't necessarily just decreasing density, that it's also improving the quality of the public spaces.
Thank you.
Rocky.
Thank you. That was interesting. I did have a question about the public space and how that relates there, but I think you answered some of that, because it seems like a lot of the missing middle housing issues work easier if they have access to more public space or green space. And so you didn't mention that in your presentation, but I appreciate what you just mentioned. I did have a question on sort of housing in general. You had a couple things that touched on it, but you mainly focused on either new development or more commercial, how to implement commercial development. And as our housing stock, a lot of it's reaching the age where it needs to be probably demolished or remodeled heavily in a lot of areas over the next 20 years. How do we do that in a way that's predictable, and what does our LDC say about that now, and something that the neighborhood can get behind, that doesn't look completely different, but obviously it's going to be new and it will be different. So just some help with that, because I think those are a lot of issues that we face as a planning commission.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So I think there's I wouldn't necessarily say that any sort of replacement of existing or aging housing stocks would necessarily have to look entirely different, depending on the types of regulations that are in place at the time of that redevelopment. Particularly, the commissioner mentioned, the use of form-based codes. Form-based codes are not only a tool of, new places or redevelopment or necessary densification. Form-based codes are often a tool that are utilized for preservation of neighborhood character. So if you have characters, those are some of I know that the core neighborhoods often have very distinct sense of place, very distinct look and feel. There are tools available to help craft, or there's tools available that would ensure and help ensure that new development that comes in or placement housing stock that comes in can match the look and feel of the existing neighborhood, and it would not seem so different as I know that some of the newer developments, and especially in some of the southern parts of the city, look and feel a lot different than the core of Fargo.
Anyone else have any questions? Scott, Art, Jennifer?
I would just like to comment that I do believe that the findings you reported are consistent with many of the challenges or complaints we hear or concerns we hear from both developers or neighborhood residents. So I do appreciate that you recognize that. I think I definitely think you got that right in terms of making our LDC more congruent so that we're having to rely less on those conditional overlays and other tools to negotiate space. And I also agree with some of the questions and comments. I think overall, I'd like to see more information or education as far as perhaps some best practice ratios or limits, maybe some guidance that gives us some information on ratios of mixed-use space, different types of mixed-use space, live-work areas, and certainly going forward, perhaps some information on how we can design spaces that are usable and also promote health and safety of the residents and the consumers.
I'll throw out one more question. I think the one word that came up a couple times with everybody was predictability, and what we as a planning commission, we seem to get the most, I'd say neighborhood or surrounding people involved with the discussion is when we have a pocket of land that hadn't been developed, and all of a sudden it gets developed in a way that again was not predictable to what they were possibly told when they bought. This is again in a residential setting. Those are a lot of the issues that we see that, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't know they were going to change lot sizes, and lot sizes tend to predict the socioeconomic of the people that would probably be living in them. And so it's that challenge is always seems to hit us square in the face.
So I mean, I can comment on that if you like. I think that there's two types of predictability. I think there's the sense of predictability that what the plan, what the policies are and what the regulations that are in place will be, followed. as they are written. So, getting a understanding that, this is the intent of this district, this parcel zone, this, has this zoning designation, and it will be developed as such. That's code predictability. But, I think there's also this sense of, change over time, and that the community it's hard to expect at all times that, a community will stay the same. So I'm not necessarily sure of the examples that you're talking about, if it's a change in city vision for a certain part of town over time, and that has changed from something more maybe commercial to more residential, or from rural to more multifamily. But as cities grow and change, there will be that does sometimes follow with policy changes. So what we can do is help ensure that regulations at least are predictable, even if policy changes over time.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I just noticed that there was some mention here about parks, pocket parks, that sort of thing. I know that the new developments, the developers are expected to contribute 10% of the land to neighborhood park. When we get to the core neighborhoods, there is the opportunity with some buildings that are too run down to turn them into that kind of green space. Have you found any kind of an equation that works for density and green space?
Let me unmute myself.
Yeah, I can jump in on. Sorry, Catherine. I can jump in on that one. That's such a broad question. I'm really struggling with how to find an answer. But yes, there is a lot of literature available on how much green space makes sense for the number of people living in a particular project is certainly one way to look at it. Or you can look at it at a block level where you have a number of different buildings sharing common space, or you could look at it at a neighborhood level. So it really comes down to figuring out whether it's a open space for the residents at the parcel, block, or community level. And as we work on the code, and as Catherine and I and Adam and David think through alternatives for how Fargo could update your code, we can certainly come back to you with different approaches for providing open space.
Thank you.
All right, see no other questions? Turn it back to Aaron.
Thanks, John. And I think we did also want to, if you're okay with it, open up the mic too to anybody in the audience that might, want to speak to this topic, if there are any. Other than that, that's really all I think staff had, unless LWC had anything else.
If I can jump in real quick, just to kind of wrap all this up. Remember, this is a two-phase process, and the first phase is to have our consultant look at the land development code and identify, is it like grossly out of date? Is it okay? Does it need a major rewrite? Does it need some minor tweaks, or does it need to be touched at all? From what I've seen over the years, the code's gotten to the point where I don't believe the Planning Commission or City Commission has much confidence in it, so therefore it's hard to be able to stand behind it when we have tough decisions to make that are created in the neighborhood. And what also happens is both sides of those tough decisions, one will say, oh, your code is great, and then the other one will say, well, I can't believe you're approving this because the code is just horrible. So I think this process is going to help us really identify where are the holes in our code and what are the next steps we need to take. And I think as a group, through Planning Commission, City Commission, those next steps would identify what do we do, and then that would create the situation where we start talking about densities if if the planning commission and city commission were to decide to do modifications of the codes. And then we would start talking about densities, then we would start talking about park ratios and mixed use. Another last thing that I think we need to be careful of when we go through this process is a lot of times I get hit up on, well, they're doing this in downtown Denver, they're doing this in Omaha. Denver has a population of 600,000. The metro has a population of 2.9 million in Denver. Omaha is 480,000 people. Fargo is 124,000 people, and our metro is 245. So some of those more dense areas are more successful because there's more people that can actually sustain those versus Fargo still being fairly rural. So as we go through this process, it's good to keep on remembering that.
If I could just say something, and it's somewhat related to what Mark was just saying. In regards to the long-term vision for the community, the diversion that we're going to be dealing with and the limit on the amount of land that we will have available to build out is, in my mind, probably an issue that we need to look at in regards to how do we make this community more economically sustainable over time. And yes, that's probably 4 or 5 decades down the road, but it seems like we need to be talking about a foundational approach to the next 5 decades, and wondering if that conversation really impacts what we're doing right now with development or in the next 10 years with development, and how can we better prepare ourselves.
All right, Aaron, do you want me to close it, or do you want to close it, or?
Well, I can just check in with Catherine Click. Did you have anything else want to talk about next steps for the final phase of this project at all, or otherwise we can talk about that in the future?
Well, I'll close by saying thank you everyone for your comments and your feedback, and we do look forward to coming back in the fall to talk about alternatives. As everyone's already been alluding to, this is just phase 1, and next we'll be coming back with some things for you to consider about how the city, might decide to move forward.
Thanks, Catherine. And then I would just add too, if anybody does have any additional thoughts or comments as you kind of chew on this after today, feel free to send those to staff, and we can incorporate those and get those comments to LWC. So, thank you.
All right, I will adjourn the meeting. Say aye. All right, thank you.